That's an interesting question, Rita, in terms of have dealt better. If we're looking at the containment of the pandemic, obviously a number of cities in the Middle East, especially the UAE and Saudi Arabia, in terms of their ability to provide during the pandemic, in terms of their ability to manage the pandemic, and more importantly now in terms of their ability to vaccinate and achieve their potential in opening up in a systematic manner. From a tourism perspective, also these two countries specifically being the UAE, and when we look at the UAE, Dubai, and perhaps the Northern Emirates of the UAE, as well as Saudi Arabia, from a tourism standpoint, they were able to capitalize their domestic tourism predominantly in Saudi Arabia. So there has been, I would call it, minimizing of losses that occurred over the summer and throughout now the Q1 of the year. But also the Dubai has been able, since the opening of 2020, July 2020 airport, they have been able also to achieve an increase, registering the highest percentage occupancy for the year 2020 at 55% in our region. My personal view is that, when we're looking at recovery and the end of the pandemic, this is too soon to be able to evaluate how soon we will return to normal. I'd like to think of it as what is a sustainable recovery. Because while we are projecting the global recovery and this region's recovery, we have to pause and reflect on pockets of demand that are supporting certain markets. So for instance, if this year turns out to be a good year for Dubai on account of the Expo 2020, we are also looking at Qatar, for instance, registering growth in 2022 on account of the World Cup. Saudi Arabia, naturally, on account of domestic tourism, they've had a better run or a better 12 months when compared to the other parts of this region, and also the continued investment into the hospitality offering. But that, in my opinion, there will be spikes of demand and not necessarily recovery. So if we can take it a step back and reconfirm, at least in my opinion, that a sustainable recovery is likely to occur in 2024, 2025. I personally think in 2021, we're going to see improved demand, but that's not necessarily to suggest that there will be recovery. As we speak today, airports remain largely closed from the feeder markets into our region. We are all watching that space to see whether the summer is going to bring about a change in travel corridor. When we look at the travel corridors, it's yet to establish what the restrictions will be and what sorts of vaccines. So it's quite unpredictable. Definitely, we're going to have a better year, but I wouldn't necessarily suggest a solid recovery would commence, in my opinion, before the mid of 2022. The second part of your question, Rita, was about the return. I'd like to tie that into the confidence level. There is a reason why Dubai may recover faster. There is a reason why, for instance, travelers are looking at destinations that have registered either the lowest number of cases or the containment is better, because the travel confidence is extremely important and we shouldn't underestimate. And naturally, when we see spikes in occupancy, everyone gets excited and we get talking about the recovery. I'm not suggesting there isn't a recovery. I'm only suggesting that one thing is to get vaccinated and one thing is to say we're going to travel, but it's all a different decision-making process when it gets to the actual booking and traveling. And I'm starting also to suggest and argue we can separate to some extent between tourism and travel. Although oftentimes they go hand in hand, we could certainly support domestic tourism while we have very little control over international travel. And they may follow a very different recovery cycle. There will be markets that definitely will benefit better. I mean, if we look outside of the immediate GCC region, we have seen, for instance, that both Turkey and Egypt, on account of their established domestic tourism, they are faring better and will continue to fare better. And this is, again, when we look at the potential recovery, realizing that the domestic tourism, especially in those markets that are established, has really helped them beyond those markets that are predominantly dependent on the international market. So when we look at, for instance, Saudi Arabia over the last 12 months, historically, they had focused very little on their domestic tourism, except naturally to the holy cities. But then suddenly, this domestic tourism, the fact that they couldn't travel outside, they have been generating enough room nights to the extent of really fueling and speeding up development. I cannot disagree with you. It's very complicated, Rita. But again, I mean, if we look historically at the tourism market in general, whether it's in Lebanon and elsewhere, it is quite cyclical. If we look at the last 20 years in the Lebanese history, we've had spikes, we've had very lows after certain incidents, and we've had highs when we were flooded with tourism. There is tourism potential, and I guess the question is moving forward with the changes that is affecting the world in general from traveler preferences, but also from a tourism offering, what can Lebanon do? So I'd like to really now reflect on, in an ideal world, when we come out of the current crisis, be it political crisis, be it economic crisis, or being the health and medical crisis, it's a country that naturally offers a lot of culture. It's a country that can capitalize on religious tourism. And in line with the new trend of experiential tourism, I personally consider there's a lot of opportunities in Lebanon, just looking at the landscape, at the nature, and also at the culture, in capitalizing a couple of investment opportunities. And when we look at investment opportunities, these by far are less expensive and less investment heavy than going into the old traditional hotel operating model, where we're building large hotels and predominantly focus on servicing, for instance, the business and the conference and events clientele. So if we were to evaluate the future development opportunities, I'd probably say religious tourism is a very strong growing segment worldwide, and more importantly, can be easily uh, promoted in Lebanon. That will not just appeal to those travelers, but that would definitely fuel the economy in the outside of the capital city of Beirut. The cost related also to these sorts of investment is minimal, and therefore the opportunities of rewards is quite high. Moving on from religious tourism into what we call experiential and cultural tourism, be it in developing trendy, glamping, tented, beach, mountain type of resorts that will really capitalize on the nature offering. From an investment perspective, these are limited investments with very high rewards in terms of clientele. And we've seen a growing segment in travelers that are seeking these type of accommodation and these type of experiences. And what that also allows to do is to come outside of the city of Beirut, which is well established in the hospitality offering, but really move outside of the city to fuel further into blending the cultural experience, because these experiential travel experiences are also all about how do you connect with culturally in the market. These are the two ideal, I would say, development opportunities proven that is in line with global trends. It shouldn't be difficult at all for us to be able to offer that, because naturally speaking, this is what Lebanon is known for. And from an investment perspective, the risk is quite low. I still think the global recovery is likely to happen in line with the regional recovery that we just discussed, which is around 24-25. From a segmentation standpoint, I know there has been a lot of discussion about what's going to happen to the corporate market, what's going to happen to the meetings and incentives markets. Are we going to meet again? Eventually, we will go back to meet, and we're going to go back to attending events. My personal view, however, is that we're going to see an immediate and a much stronger recovery in the leisure segment on account of people just wanting to get out there. We will see a longer term recovery in the corporate segment, especially in markets where they are still developing. I think what we have been able to establish over the last 12 months is that a lot of our business can be done online. With that said, there's a lot of business that you would still need to travel for, and you still need to meet people face to face. And this is more relevant, in my opinion, to the less established markets. So when we look at the Middle East and Africa, I definitely see a continued growth in the business and meeting and incentive markets versus elsewhere. Also keeping in mind that large corporations have taken a hit, and therefore their budgets for the corporate segment is much more limited, at least in the next couple of years, until business is back to a full recovery mode. But there will be a recovery starting, as I said earlier on, in my opinion, global recovery. When we look at travel and tourism recovering together, sometime mid 2022 and all the way up to 24, 25, when we would achieve full recovery. There will naturally be some markets. I mean, we have to always remember, what are we comparing to? Are we comparing to 2019 or 17? I mean, every market has specifically achieved its highest record in a specific year. And therefore, that would be the recovery up to that year when they had the highest, say, occupancy or the highest international visitation or airport arrivals. So not necessarily always comparing back to 2019, but comparing to what seemed to be for that specific market a potential year of growth. Naturally, markets that are just evolving, such as Saudi Arabia, we will be looking forward to what the new recovery will look like and what the new investments and developments, how they will transform the market, and what are these different markets likely to achieve as a longer term sustainable occupancy and performance. We're seeing not necessarily emerging trends, but trends that have started in 2 to 3 years that have only been fueled by this pandemic. I mean, if we look at all the arguments that were made about life-work balance, I mean, this is not a new topic. This is something that in the last 5 years, the world has started saying we need to find more balance for us to enjoy our lives and in order to travel more and have our own private time. So this trend has started emerging. So we've seen an increased demand into experiential traveling, into cultural traveling, and also for people to connecting. And that has been fueled further during this pandemic. So we've seen, for instance, resorts that were remote or that were not necessarily crowded, they got quite good occupancies during the pandemic, and people continued to travel and stay at these resorts. And this is what is likely to continue. And I would probably just say that these trends will now be fueled and developed faster than in a traditional way, when it would have taken a 10 years to establish a certain trend. From an investment perspective, I think the world is headed towards more service-oriented, personalized, small investments, and experiential investment. Okay. There will continue to be development into the traditional brands and large hotels, especially in underdeveloped cities. But in terms of investment opportunities, this is what is likely to be further developed in the near to mid-term. Definitely a much more focus on the wellness type of developments and retreats. Again, be it full wellness or be it wellness on the back of medical. In terms of guest preferences, there is a preference to having more time to travel, more personal time, which then would mean that we will see travelers traveling much more frequently, but for shorter periods of time than traditionally, when typically you would take one trip a year for 3 weeks. It is likely, and this has started and likely to continue, that we are taking much more smaller holidays, but frequently throughout the year. Potentially during the lockdown and the pandemic, yes, when traveler needed to travel, they made choices to stay at hotels and branded hotels because there is more confidence in the brand or in the management of the pandemic. With that said, once we come out of this pandemic, Airbnb will continue to play a role in shaping the industry, in disrupting the industry, and in competing with hotels. What Airbnb cannot do is compete with those experiential resorts that are 20 keys somewhere out there where the whole experience is being at that resort. But for your traditional traveler that is there to visit a city, to meet up with friends, or to just the convenience of having a larger space, Airbnb is there to stay. I mean, there are challenges around also the governance of Airbnb, yes. But with time, I can see that this is this overlap between hotel stay and residential accommodation will become thinner. We just have to be realistic in our expectations. I mean, when we compare what's happened today to last year, nothing much has changed, frankly, other than the fact that we have now managed to vaccinate people. And that's great. And that's a big achievement that we need to celebrate. But realistically, when we look at travel restrictions, when we look at the governments coming together, when we look at trying to really understand how are we going to travel, there is very little we know more today than what we knew 6 months ago. Ideally, we would want to have more clarity in order to be able to forecast better how will recovery look like. This is why I was saying earlier on, I'd rather separate between what we can do from a tourism perspective versus what we can do from an international travel standpoint. So I would have ideally liked to see much more improvement in the way the governments are speaking to each other, in the way we are coming together as a community. It does seem we are doing extremely well, or some countries or governments are doing extremely well at a local level in terms of containing the pandemic, vaccinating people, opening up with certain restrictions in place. Ideally, for this sector to recover, we're going to need to understand a little bit more. We're doing the right thing, being the citizens of this world. We're doing the right thing. We're taking our vaccine, but in terms of really understanding what does it mean and what this global passport would look like, and how soon are we going to be able to integrate the local efforts into some sort of a global platform that will allow you to identify travelers based on the vaccines and allow them to travel. I'm not sure there is enough clarity as yet.